In case you didn't notice, they announced an artifact reroller for Genshin to be added, right? So the misery of the RNG of artifacts is over, right? No more randomized well, it's still randomized, but you'll be able to re-roll, and like you can choose whether or not you keep the new one or the old one. It's amazing, right? And I think it is. Like, don't get me wrong, I think it is, but I think in a lot of the conversation that I've seen people have online so far about this, notably, I think some people are missing that there's a lot of unknown factors for how the specific implementation of this works, and some people are drawing conclusions for like how this is going to affect a gameplay experience. And quite frankly, I think this is going to be a positive change for me and for any other high investment player at least. Seems to me that this is going to be a high investment player reward, and I want to break down this more specifically. Not because I'm trying to like say, update terrible. I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm just trying to be realistic, okay? We're getting a little hyped up for a feature that we don't know enough about, so we should take one step back before we get too excited. And I also wanted to have a yap about how most likely these are going to be their most valuable. So real quick, I'm going to flick through some of the pages in their stream just so we can read exactly what they showed, because there's specific things we know and a lot of specific things we don't know. So this new thing is called the Dust of Enlightenment, and we can get a total of 3 of these things per patch. You can see in the top here, there is the Dire Commendation effect. And then there is these 2 rewards, and this is all rewards for interacting with the new permanent combat content. The baseline one that requires 1200 prestige, I believe that is a 1-to-1 conversion for resin, which means you have to spend 1200 resin, which is about a week's worth of resin, by the way, for artifacts. You'll get a little bit more artifacts through this per resin spent than you get through normal artifact farming, but it's mostly just like normal artifact farming, but you're fighting different enemies in this new combat content rather than the domains, right? I think you can do that on the low difficulty, although I'm not 100% sure of that, but this is the easiest one of these to acquire. If you're someone who farms artifacts normally at least a week per patch anyways, then this is 1 reroller per patch. Although, importantly, this is one of the unknowns, we don't exactly know for sure that 1 reroller can reroll any artifact, right? One of the unknowns that people are theorizing might be maybe it's like elixirs, where maybe for a goblet you need multiple of these little feathers. They showed on stream rerolling specifically a feather and it only costing 1. But anyways, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Point being, one of these is usable to reroll something. We don't know for sure that it can reroll any artifact. So if you have that wonderful onset goblet for your Arlecchino but rolled really poopy, maybe it'll cost more. We don't know. The other important thing actually I think is worth mentioning right now is also this content is not going to be available until the 25th of June, so not when the patch launches. We'll have to wait a week or 2. I don't think that's that big a deal, but it's worth being aware of. Our questions that we're having today about how this works exactly are not going to be answered next week, unfortunately. The other thing worth mentioning, though, for this new endgame content, difficulty 4 and difficulty 5 is where you get the other 2 free runs per patch. And difficulty 5 is going to be difficult. Difficulty 4 is probably also going to be difficult. How difficult for you will depend on your account. You need 3 different teams to be able to challenge this game mode. You can do co-op for below difficulty 5 and get the reward for it, right? You notice it says in single player mode only. It's just important to know that there's a lot of players that will not be able, in particular, to get this last one, I suspect. Which again is part of why I'm thinking this is largely intended to be an endgame player reward for someone who already has really invested teams and builds. So I don't think this is something that's like intended to make it so casual players can get their good artifacts easier. It might be able to. Essentially, it's the players that already have good builds and teams, aka the ones who are also then the people who will see the least like actual gameplay change from having an improved artifact. Like you get more value from a really good artifact the lower investment your build is, right? If all of your artifacts on your character are like, low crit value, so only a couple crit rolls, and then you get 1 artifact that has, 40 CV, right? So all crit rolls. That 1 artifact is going to make a much more exaggerated difference to your experience than a fully invested player who uses a reroller to get 1 more crit roll, right? But their build is already like 80% crit rate with 200 crit damage or something. And that's kind of the builds you're probably going to need to clear this end game content most likely. Maybe I'll be wrong though. Maybe it'll be easier than I expect. I haven't played the new endgame yet. I don't live in the future, and you haven't either, right? And that's my point, is like, we should not make assumptions on how easy these are to acquire for all players. My vibe is that this permanent content is structured like they have structured events in the past with bosses with special mechanics, and that means I think that this content is going to be fairly difficult to get these max rewards. But let's move on. Another important aspect of this, and this is a big part of the unknown, they showed this page here, where you can select 2 minor affixes. After reshaping, the selected minor affixes will receive at least 2 enhancements in total. So presumably that means if you choose crit rate, crit damage, you should get a crit rate and crit damage roll. Now this is a really important aspect of these things, which makes them more valuable. I'm gonna guess that this is a pity system like the elixir change was, which is to say that this is probably less good than it seems like it is. So in case you're not aware how elixirs now work, is that the 2 subsets you select are guaranteed to get 2 rolls into the selected stats. So like if you made this feather with an elixir, it would have 2 guaranteed rolls into crit rate and crit damage. That guarantee system only takes effect if you missed all of the previous rolls. So my presumption is this works the exact same way. So the important thing is it doesn't actually increase your chance of getting the best artifact. It does not increase your chance of getting the 40 crit value pieces. What this does is ensure that you have a minimum baseline level. It ensures that this kind of garbage artifact they showed on stream has at least 1 additional crit roll, right? So 1 additional defense or this roll into ER would roll into crit rate instead is what this should do. It's possible this works different than elixirs though. I'm making an assumption here, and that's important to disclaim when we're talking about this feature. We don't know. I'm just basing that off of something they currently implemented, and using that to illustrate that it does not necessarily increase the chance you get really good quality artifacts. It just ensures you don't get super crap ones. It ensures you have a baseline minimum value from the reroller, and that's good, but I also think this reroller is almost assuredly going to be best used for re-rolling specifically like the best quality artifacts with like baseline substats. So this is a good feature if that's how it's implemented, because it, you know, can be used smartly to ensure you get at least 1 minimum additional stat. But I suspect most people are going to find themselves using this on like 4-line artifacts, because 4-line artifacts, because they can get 5 total stat upgrades, have inherently a lot more potential to be better than 3-line artifacts. And this artifact was a 4-line artifact, by the way. So a more common circumstance might be if you had a 4-line artifact that was like 1 crit rate roll, 1 crit damage roll, and say in like 3 ER rolls instead of this piece, then you re-roll that piece, and it's not going to guarantee any additional stats because you already had 2 rolls into those stats. So the 2 guaranteed affixes thing doesn't do anything. But then there's another unknown, which you see this little UI in the bottom, hollowed exegenesis. Whatever the frick that word means, because they didn't explain it. We can go back here and see a little bit of information. When reshaping this artifact, you must select 2 affixes, and then it highlights the total of 2 here. Consuming Dust of Enlightenment and Feathers to reroll things will grant a fixed amount of hollowed exegesis. Once you reach a certain amount of progress, a higher level of artifact reshaping will become available. What people are kind of guessing this means, because it says, you know, 0 out of 6 to 1 out of 6, means that maybe if you reroll this artifact 6 times, which is a lot, the assumption is that after those 6 times, you get a guaranteed additional thing you can select. So instead of 2 guaranteed substats into crit, if you selected crit rate and crit damage, it gives you 3 guaranteed. And maybe it can go to even 4. Maybe it can go to 5. If that is the case, if you can like slowly hoard these resources, and it might take a ton of these, right? We don't know. We don't know exactly how this system works. It does show 3 tiers, which implies to me that that might be the case. You might be able to make it so that these reroller things can eventually guarantee a 4-line artifact gives you 5 crit rate, crit damage rolls, which is insane if true. But it also is going to take potentially 18 of these to do that. And if you are buying the battle pass, you can get a total of 4 of these per patch, which is going to take 4.5 patches, and they do 8 patches per year. So like it's going to take you more than half a year's of patches to potentially, you know, get a perfect piece for that. But if you already have something that is like a perfect artifact, let me show you an example of one. I'll give you this example. My Arlecchino on my Polearm Only account, I'm using an off-piece feather. But I have this piece, right? This was a 4-line artifact. You can tell because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rolls. So it started with 4 lines, but rolled, you know, 3 times into attack, EM, and then crit rate. Attack percent isn't bad at all. One thing you might not realize, by the way, as far as min-maxing builds, is whether or not you have this extra attack percent in conjunction with your crit rate, crit damage, is the difference maker on whether or not this artifact can be meaningfully better. Like if you're someone that cares about Akasha rankings, not that you should build all your characters around Akasha rankings. I'm just saying if you're someone who cares about min-maxing your builds, whether or not you have this attack percent there is actually important, but the ideal rolls are obviously still crit for Arlecchino, generally speaking. And rerolling this artifact could be amazing, especially if I can reroll it continually until it is perfect. If it takes half a year to reroll this until it's perfect, fine. That means I can get a perfect artifact that's an onset piece for her, and then that enables me to have an offset piece elsewhere, right? But that's all an assumption. This is an assumption. We don't actually know. We don't know exactly how many it will cost to do this. We don't actually know it will be able to guarantee getting the literal perfect artifact. We don't know how much RNG this actually removes from the system, or this is just RNG, but additional layer of RNG. It's a good addition, but we don't know exactly the effect. And again, I think this is mostly like at its most valuable for a high investment experience. You still have to get that really rare artifact at a baseline, like that feather I showed you with Arlecchino. It's not easy to get a perfect 4-line piece that has the 4 ideal substats, right? That is the ideal with this reroller most likely, but you got to get that artifact in the baseline in the first place. Even elixirs don't really help you get those perfect 4-line pieces because elixirs only let you choose 2 lines, not 4, and they also aren't guaranteeing 4-line pieces. The point is, this doesn't really save you from like the misery of the artifact grind, right? Again, this is like a high investment reward. It's a reward for you've already done a bunch of things. You still have to do a bunch of things to take advantage of the thing. It just lets you feel better once you get the baseline thing, because you know you can potentially, hopefully, assuming this, turn it into something really good in the future. And that's great. This is going to make things like Akasha rankings really weird, where a lot of people are going to suddenly have a lot higher average, like, quality on their builds be uplifted. So if you're someone who is stupid and is trying to get, you know, #1 spot on a leaderboard, only insane people do that. Don't do that. Like, this is going to make that weird, is my point. And you being in #1 spot's probably going to come down to, like, and I'm not kidding about this, whether or not you have like an ideal amount of like flat attack on your timepiece, for example, and also how high roll value your crit rolls are, because you can have like a minimum crit damage roll of 5.4 versus a maximum of 7.8. Although again, theoretically, this reroller, if we can use it a million times, should be able to be reused until you get high roll values. There's going to be a balanced stopping point realistically for when it makes sense to keep using these on one particular artifact. There's probably going to be people in the future that are going to make videos like doing actual statistical analysis on what the optimal way to use these things are. But again, that's going to have to take until we actually know how these work exactly. That will let us determine where we use these best, but we don't know right now. We're just making a lot of assumptions. At the end of the day, I think this is just going to be a for fun thing, because like let's be real. If you care about this artifact reroller in the first place, like if you clicked on this video, as much as you or I might complain about RNG misery, it didn't roll crit or whatever, we also equally experience some dopamine. We hate it, but we also we have to admit to ourselves, right? We like the dopamine when artifacts roll entirely into crit.
You like Krabby Patties, don't you, Squidward?
The reroller, in my opinion, just like changes that dynamic a little bit, wherein as time goes on, and I say as time goes on because it's going to take maybe, half a year to change this artifact into a perfect artifact, but it's going to change the dynamic into you care about getting this at a baseline first, and then it's just a question of how many rerollers does it take, maybe, to perfect it, but also maybe there's limitations again. We don't know. We don't know. There's too many things we don't know. We can be excited. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to basically probably nearly perfecting my Arlecchino build, but it's also probably going to take many months still to perfect the build. And whether or not it actually makes sense to perfect my Arlecchino's build versus investing more in my other character builds is a completely different question, right? I have made multiple videos at this point where I use like purposely unoptimal combinations of artifacts on different characters. For example, I actually made a video last year where I built Arlecchino with no crit substats at all. I purposely farmed artifacts that just had like attack percent and EM substats, and it was really easy to clear. To be clear, I had a C1 Arlecchino, but like C1 Arlecchino isn't a 500 times damage increase, it's a 25% damage increase, and I cleared very much with time to spare. And my point with this is like, min-maxing our builds doesn't really change the in-game experience to a crazy degree. It's possible it will in the future though, because maybe this new endgame is so much harder that we need to min-max our builds that much more. But that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we have to min-max our builds more for this new endgame, but the new endgame is what gives us the tool to min-max our builds more, what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? That's what this is on a design level. And at the end of the day, I think all those details are unimportant, because I think it's just fun to be able to get better builds on our characters and see big numbers from our characters. And this is just another tool to make that easier. It's to reduce the RNG-ness while also still having the value of the RNG-ness for the dopamine moments it gives. Recently, when farming the domain, not even Strongbox, which you expect to give better artifacts on average, I got a random Pyro Goblet on set from the domain. It rolled basically perfectly. This is the kind of artifact I'm probably not going to reroll. The only reason to reroll this piece would be to try to get like slightly higher roll values and crit damage, because theoretically it could be like a 45 crit value piece or whatever, right? But that's like really, really hyper min-maxy things that are really stupid to do. But just because I like Arlecchino that much, maybe I'll do it. I don't know. You have the choice to keep the old one, so if it goes poorly, I don't need to, scrap my current good piece, right? It's hard to imagine this system is implemented in a way that is really bad, but I will say that elixirs actually become slightly better with the rerollers existing, because the rerollers exaggerate, again, like having that baseline good artifact, because you can turn that baseline good substat artifact into a good artifact eventually. Again, you're going to have to be picky. Like, you're going to have to be smart with what you choose. And what you choose is going to really just depend on your account, your priorities, your preferences. This artifact reroller theoretically uplifts the average artifact quality such that maybe we should reevaluate on a community level how we actually, like the baseline standard of how we evaluate character strength. Realistically, I don't think we should. And again, that comes back to how I'm of the opinion that I think this is going to be primarily an endgame investment reward. To get the most value from the artifact reroller thing, you're going to already have to have invested teams and builds in the first place, such that I don't think this is actually going to uplift the average player's experience with, building their characters. I don't think we should really crazily change our standards for how we evaluate character strength, just because of the fact that a reroller exists that can give an invested player better builds, right? But at the same time, it might be possible that it does. I could be wrong, right? I want to acknowledge that. We don't know. Maybe it will actually crazily uplift the average quality of like people's builds, but it also implies that people will know how to build their characters. And like one problem a lot of people have is that they like under prioritize different stats. And, maybe this artifact reroller will just make that aspect worse, so people will over prioritize crit even more, and they will forget that they need the other stats on their build to make their builds function. Yada yada, I don't know. We'll see what happens. It'll be interesting. Overall, it's another tool, and as long as you know how to use the tool, is a good thing. Your account is not the same as someone else's account. It depends. It just depends. And we don't know how it works, so we don't know exactly what it'll do. There's lots of unknowns. I think this will be a very positive, fun addition to the game, and should help address, the flaws of the inherent RNG of the equipment system of this game. And most likely you should plan to use this for your 4-line artifacts, I think. But maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe I'll have to make a YouTuber apology video. I don't know. Probably not. Anyways, I think I have yapped for far longer than I intended to about something simple. But anyways, more important than all this, by the way, is the new endgame can be played in co-op. Difficult endgame co-op that's permanent exists now, and regardless of you not being able to get the rewards for it, I think it's awesome that it exists at all. I'm very happy about that. I look forward to that actually more than anything in the patch upcoming. Obviously new characters and all that looks cool, but anyways, bye.